So let's talk about etiquette and wargames behaving badly, with 9 that guy moves for Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it might be fun to run down a few thorny sticking points on the gaming table, and perhaps just a few moves or decisions that might not leave you as popular in the eyes of your opponent. Obviously etiquette, politeness, or how sensitive people are does vary from person to person. The vast majority of wargamers, in my opinion, are pretty laid back, and just because someone does one of these a little bit doesn't necessarily mean that they're a terrible person. Though maybe if you're managing to check off the majority of the list within one game, you might not necessarily be as likely to be invited back for another one. I'm sure plenty of you have got your own horror stories as to people being impolite or just generally unpleasant to play against in 40k, so feel free to let us know down in the comments below. But here are just a few examples of some of the more common things. For the record, this one isn't an Auspex Tactics face reveal or anything, I just felt like this guy fit the scene on the stock images website, so sorry for labelling him this guy. He's pulling a good face, but I'm sure he's a lovely chap in person. Slandering this poor stock image guy aside, let's jump straight in. First up, 40k is certainly a hobby where you can dedicate inordinate amounts of time into your little plastic soldiers, so one fairly reliable way of annoying the other person is not respecting their models. There's nothing like getting greasy food and sweat smeared over something that you spent absolutely hours trying to make look nice, never mind being careless or actually damaging or breaking anything. In general, I think that most people are fine with people picking up their models for a closer look, but seeing as they're not your own things, I would most certainly ask first, as people's tolerance to that will vary quite a bit. I think to most people it's pretty obvious to be careful with something if it's painted to a display level standard, and people might take a bit more care over it than other miniatures, but even if you consider the paintwork not to be particularly good or anything, it still might well represent an enormous amount of time and effort invested for the person in question. For the most part, people generally tend to pick up models by the base. That way you usually have a bit less chance of damaging any fragile bits, or getting things on the actual paintwork of the miniature itself, and obviously I make sure that you're not getting grease all over it, and of course damage and breaking anything and knocking it off the table is a bit of a faux pas. I think most people get that accidents happen from time to time if you're not intending anything, but it's still a very cringy moment if you damage something important, given the amount of time and effort that goes into miniature making, but also they might cost quite a lot monetarily just from Games Workshop's prices. Perhaps that's rule 1 of Warhammer etiquette: don't damage the other player's model soldiers. Next up, I thought it was worth just mentioning an obvious one. Cheating in any form is going to go down pretty badly. Some people might feel a bit differently, but at least within my own head I like to divide things a little bit into hard cheating or soft cheating. Perhaps hard cheating being a little bit more obviously and deliberately trying to mislead the other player. Generally things where you can pretty much determine intent was behind the cheating, as opposed to just playing carelessly and loosely, maybe with your own biases. Examples of perhaps the worst cheating will be just deliberately misleading your opponent about game rules. The intent becomes a bit more apparent if they make multiple big errors in their favour over the course of the game. Perhaps doing dodgy things with dice, perhaps rolling them behind terrain so your opponent can't see the exact results and picking them up before you can see, or tampering with the dice in any way such as actually having them weighted. Perhaps other examples of this could be deliberately taking more units than you have points for in your army, or deliberately not keeping score right, though I guess that's often more likely to be an accident rather than deliberate cheating. In my experience at least, hard cheating like this does tend to be pretty rare. People who do it brazenly just quickly get a reputation and nobody really wants to play with them anymore. Not bending the rules in your favour is pretty much the basics of respectful play within a game. After all, what's the point in playing in the first place? If the only reason that you're getting a victory is because you've abused the rules all over the place, it'd kind of take any sense of accomplishment out of the victory, at least in my mind. Perhaps hand in hand with this, but also very annoying to play against, is what I'd term soft cheating. I generally describe this as just playing a bit sloppily, perhaps not being too precise about measurements, or letting your biases creep in to remembering any rules, where perhaps you might be more likely to argue some things in your favour, just purely because that's the way that you want it to be on the board right then. I think perhaps examples of this could include something like a bit of optimistic measuring, maybe not properly measuring for how long it will really take your model to go around the enemy models properly, or not taking enough distance to go around terrain, which can be surprisingly far when you account for the back of the base needing to go around the edge of an outcrop or something. Another common thing is something like gaining the width of your base on your movement, say measuring from the front of your unit and then putting the back of it where you've measured to, as that gains the entire width of the model's base or hull. Other things might not be trying to properly grasp the subtleties of rules that might negatively impact you, maybe say not remembering that your feel no pain save doesn't work against mortal wounds or something like that, or perhaps being a bit sloppy with dice and not being clear of intent of dice before rolling, or perhaps being a bit selective as to which hits you pick up if some dice are cocked, Some dice aren't flat on the floor, and perhaps some people might be a bit selective as to whether they re-roll them or not, depending on whether or not they like the result. In general, for the most part, I'd say that soft cheating isn't really quite as clearly formed in the opponent's mind as to they're trying to deceive their opponent, but maybe it's just more letting bias and laziness creep in. But it can still be very annoying to play against, and it doesn't really feel very respectful when you're on the other side of the table. Perhaps another potentially unpleasant thing in the wrong circumstances is a bit of list tailoring. I'd say that in general in 40k it might usually be best to design lists that are designed to fight any army that you come up against and maybe take down the strongest things in the wider 40k ecosystem, rather than tailoring a response to just one player or just one group of players. I'd say though, if you just know that you're playing one person and you know what army they're going to be bringing, it's probably best not to tailor an exact counter to the models that they're going to bring, as if you turn up with the exact perfect right tools for the job, you're likely going to be at a massive advantage. I think perhaps one of the clearest examples might be, say you're playing knights at a 2000 point game with competitive lists. If the player who knows that they're fighting knights just brings literally nothing but anti-tank guns in their army, it's going to be a very short game. There's likely going to be a lot of dead knights, as you brought a huge amount of the right counter in your list. The same could be true, say, if you know you're fighting a horde army and load up on nothing but anti-infantry weapons, or perhaps other specific armies in the game with given weaknesses, say 1000 Suns, and you take 4 or 5 anti-psyche units that you wouldn't have taken normally. It could also be a bit problematic if you see your opponent's list and then wind up picking the best of your set options to take it down. That's the sort of thing that might happen with pickup games if someone just wants an easy win, or even just choosing which army you're going to play with depending on what enemy army you're facing, knowing that one of your armies will massively destroy the enemy's army, whereas the other one will likely have a very hard fight. Again, that does feel a bit like list tailoring. I think for the most part it's largely going to be best trying to avoid it a bit, though I think there are situations where it's not really all that bad an issue. Say for example, if you've got two good friends playing and they're both slightly tailoring their list against their opponents and it winds up being fairly balanced, then that's all well and good. Or potentially if one player is significantly less good at the game, playing against a really experienced opponent, and perhaps one of the best options for having an actual balanced game is to tailor their list slightly, and it might mean that they catch up a little bit even if they don't win. In general though, I'd largely leave it by the wayside. If you were playing at top level play and you went to a big tournament, you'd only be able to tailor a list to fight the meta, as opposed to fighting one individual person and absolutely wailing on their army. Next up, and something that I've touched on in previous videos, might be heavy use of gotcha rules, say for example that whole Auspex scan scenario that we discussed on the channel before. 40k is a vast game contents wise, and the vast majority of players are just not going to be able to keep up with what their opponent's armies are able to do. Lots of people play infrequently, and even if you play against one opponent's army regularly, there's still going to be things about their codex that you're not really familiar with. Combine that with the power of certain things like stratagems to really hit the enemy hard, say for example intercepting a squad that comes in too close, and you might well have people making very silly moves that if they knew their opponent's options, then they wouldn't be making that obvious play. I think generally out of politeness it's usually nice to mention obvious trap things before springing them, though quite a few people have got into the habit of asking about obvious things that might go wrong, like intercept or heroic intervention type abilities, but it's not necessarily the sort of thing that new players are going to know to ask. Plenty of people don't really see anything wrong with using something like a surprise stratagem on the opponent, that way they learn for next time in theory, and they'd expect no less of their opponent. But regardless of that, there are quite a lot of people in the community who wouldn't really appreciate having their army deleted from a surprise move, and it could just kind of cheapen the entire game experience. A case of, oh yes, that was a good game, shame the entire thing was decided just by my opponent using a stratagem that I wasn't aware of. I think perhaps another example of this might be doing some very punishing things for turn sequencing type mistakes. I remember there was a case at a tournament not so long ago where some guy helped the other one deploy, helped him and encouraged him to put out all his reserves on the table, and then said no, you've put reserves down now so the rest of your army can't move for this turn, and basically cost him the entire game then and there. It might have won him the game, but it also won him the ire of about half the 40k community who'd heard about it. Sometimes showing a bit of sportsmanship might just be a bit better, even if it does lessen your chance of winning. Those sorts of things are always a bit of a grey area spectrum though. Would you let someone go back and do their psychic phase after they've just shot one gun? Or what about the same thing but they've done their entire shooting phase, so you have kind of moved on to the next phase? Generally I tend to be fairly happy with people going back and doing things if they wouldn't have changed anything anyway. But there's lots of people out there who have different opinions as to what their tolerances for this sort of thing is. In any case, I'd say that overall, if you make too much use of things like you fell into my trap and then get very annoying about it, you are going to tick at least a few people off. Perhaps another thing that could be slightly annoying on the game table Could be having your models really not clear what they represent in game via having things like half-built or unbuilt models, or perhaps excessive or confusing proxying. Proxying is generally counting one thing as another unit in game. Say for example, in this game my plasma gun marines are counting as melter guns as I want to try them out, or I'd quite like to try out the rules for this tank that I don't own yet to maybe decide whether or not I'm going to get one. I feel like that kind of thing in moderation is rarely going to be too harmful. It could perhaps be a little bit immersion breaking, say if you had a Rhino tank trundling around the board and just blasting entire squads off the table with guns that it doesn't really have. But I think for the most part people would generally be quite understanding about wanting to try out a unit or two, or a really obvious and simple counts as, say for example, my chaplain's got a cool sword, but it actually counts as a Crozius Arcanum instead. I'd say the biggest issue though is if you're proxying things, is if you take it a bit too far and it gets annoying and confusing for the opponent, and they're unable to tell what sort of units are armed with what, and make completely bad decisions based on not understanding the army that they're looking at. I think if you're proxying a bunch of stuff in your army, the onus is on you to explain to your opponent that they understand which unit is, and maybe continue to remind them throughout the game, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. It could be a bit of a feels bad moment if you charge into something that looks like a bunch of Space Marine intercessors, and you've actually forgotten that they were being Blade Guard veterans today or something. That could be pretty annoying if it actually affects gameplay. I think another sensible idea is not to proxy two exact similar models as two completely different things. Say having one intercessor squad that counts as Hellblasters, but another intercessor squad that's just the same that is actually just standard intercessors. It might create a bit of an annoying mental load for the opponent. Overall, in isolation, a bit of proxying I don't think is too bad at all, but it might potentially be just another annoying thing to try and keep track of in the game if the opponent's also doing a bit of sloppy play with some soft cheating potentially, and it could be a contributing factor into making a game feel a bit more miserable. Quite apart from things just happening on the table, I think it's also worth mentioning that being a particularly sore loser or winner could certainly impact on your opponent's enjoyment. I'd say maybe being a bit too sulky and losing is a bit more common than being a bit too boastful when winning, but they both could be kind of annoying. I would say that there's nothing wrong with aiming and wanting to win a game of 40k. It is a game after all, you usually want to try and win, and it can be annoying when things don't go your way, either because you made a tactical blunder, the opponent's had some good luck, or potentially just for ways that the mission and the matchup has fell, or perhaps just power disparities between armies caused by game balance issues. I've seen otherwise very, very nice people occasionally just get a bit moody, and I think it's not uncommon for people to have occasional flashes of mild annoyance when something goes very horribly wrong and something goes against you. I think for the most part though, people would agree that you don't want to make a fair loss into your opponent's problem, and getting too annoyed about any one thing just isn't really worth it. Ranting about game balance isn't exactly news to most people, it's always been a bit out of whack for Warhammer as long as it's existed. Moaning too much about bad luck isn't great either, your dice might well have been terrible. Sometimes it does happen and it's a dice game, and you might well be underestimating all the things that did go well for you over the game as well. I feel like perhaps sometimes it's a little bit too easy to point the finger at opponents' armies being overpowered or unfair as well. But I would bear in mind that things might not be quite as rosy on the other side of the table. Most armies do have some pretty big limitations, even if they feel overwhelming to your army here and now. In general, I think it's a better mark of respect to try and avoid doing anything that diminishes your opponent. Nothing wrong saying that a contributing factor was your bad dice, or the fact that their army is quite strong, but much better to do that while having a laugh about it, as opposed to being genuinely annoyed. It is a game of model soldiers after all, and a social interaction, and it's only really got so much power to spoil your day. I would also bear in mind as well that it's important to win with grace as well as lose with grace. Nothing wrong with talking through the game or anything, though probably best not to just spend the entire time patting yourself on the back and lecturing the opponent as to how much better you are at the game than them. Sometimes they might well be in the mood to talk tactics, but to make sure that you're also listening to your opponent and not just talking at them. Next up, with models as with life in general, people just aren't going to appreciate having their time wasted, and that's potentially another way that you can get people annoyed at you, particularly combined with other things on this list. Perhaps either turning up late, conceding a game too early or needing to go, or just not really having any sort of sense of progression with a game of 40k and the impetus to keep things moving. I think generally when you're playing models, you usually want to have a fairly even amount of time that you're active and your opponent's active, and I think most people don't really want to sit through entire turns that are like 3 times as long as their own, either if it's because it's moving a horde, or if it's firing 100 different guns at you, whether or not they're particularly effective or not. I think in general it's a good idea to keep playing promptly somewhere in the back of your mind, There's lots of things that can contribute, including being indecisive, not really knowing your rules, and some armies just take a lot longer to play than others. Say for example, if you have decided to run a 250 model horde on the gaming table. I think the general expectation is that if you're running a big army or a complex one, I think the onus is still on the player with the army to make sure that they can play with it at a reasonable pace. Otherwise the game situation isn't going to work, you might just run out of time in which you've got to play things. And at tournaments, it's occasionally been an area of cheating, where you basically deliberately play very slowly, you run out of time, and you just happen to be ahead at the point when the game has to end. In general, people tend to be at least fairly savvy to this sort of thing, or don't really try it in the first place. Other potential areas of bad timekeeping could be turning up late, might mean that you never get to finish the game in the first place, which can be pretty frustrating. Maybe not quite budgeting enough time to play a proper game with your opponent, and having to shoot off after you've done the first movement phase. Again, that's not likely to be the most fulfilling experience for your opponent. I think conceding too early can also be a little bit disrespectful as well. Even if things are going fairly badly for you, a lot of people might throw in the towel far too early. So I think it's usually quite nice to let your opponent use their units to the maximum of their ability for a turn or two, and perhaps only give up altogether once you don't have that many models left on the table. On the other hand though, if the opponent does perhaps want to concede, if the outcome really isn't any longer in doubt, then there's no real point in delaying things any more than you need to. Perhaps finish up the last turn fairly promptly, smash a few more of their units, and then call it game and talk it out from there. In general, I think this one's not too hard to understand, just don't waste the other person's time. Last but far from least, in another basic act of humanity, you probably don't want to smell like you've applied no deodorant and then gone for a marathon before playing the game. I think for the most part real life 40k fans don't tend to necessarily just look like the standard sweaty nerd in the game shop stereotype, but perhaps best to make sure that we're not backsliding to that kind of way, particularly in the potentially pretty warm and sweaty halls of a tournament. You can play Nurgle and just say that you're playing lore appropriate, but I'm not sure that's necessarily going to get you invited back to too many more games. In summary, don't stink, it's not that hard. So with that particular gem of wisdom out the way, I think that just about wraps us up for our list of 9 that guy moves that you can do in Warhammer 40k, though I'm sure it's far from an exhaustive list. I look forward to hearing any other interesting takes or horror stories down in the comments below. I'm sure you guys will have some good stuff as always. Again, I definitely would underline that just doing 1 or 2 of these from time to time isn't exactly the end of the world, and there's no reason to think that they might not be a great person to have on the other side of the tabletop. I just feel that maybe if you take most of these, lump them all together, and you probably wind up with someone who you don't really want to be getting in games with too regularly. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying quite a bit, then any support on the channel's Patreon page is massively appreciated. It is the thing that keeps all these videos coming quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously helpful. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.